my goal here today is ultimately not to solve for like one specific problem statement or one specific case, but to take a step back, provide some context on sort of how Microsoft is looking at some of the very talent shortage, the talent problems, the challenges that are facing the healthcare industry today, and also to really to provide some resources because I've spoken at AngelBeat in the past a bunch of times, and oftentimes we sort of dive deep into very specific areas of technology, specific services within Azure, sort of the architecture and design behind those, and those are fun. I love doing that. I hope to do it again in the future. But given sort of the pace of things over the last year or more, I thought that it made sense to sort of highlight some of the resources that I'm always using with customers as we're talking about building new solutions in Azure. So that's where we're gonna start today. I'm gonna make sure that I stay on time here as much as I can too. So you've heard this before, right? Across the global landscape, every company is becoming a software company. Everybody's still talking about digital transformation, but once we get past the executive pitches, ultimately it's the software engineers that are building out this ecosystem. Lewis talked about the talent shortage, and according to a study by McKinsey and Company, there are over 20 million software engineers worldwide, right? And what I find interesting is that half of those are actually working in companies that we would not traditionally see as a technology company. And it's still not enough, right? We still need far more in order to meet the application demands that are coming for us. Now, there we are. Now, of course, within our industry, we have partners and customers that are, have their own set of challenges. Some of these are legacy challenges that have been with us for many years. Things like data silos, the combination of both paper and electronic records that we're trying to deal with. And some of them are new and sort of specifically related to this need for a digital transformation. I like thinking about sort of increasing patient outcomes or patient expectations, right? We're all patients. We're all also sort of citizens of this digital world where we carry around a computer in our pocket at almost all times of the day. And so our expectations for how we interact with our providers, how we interact with companies and with each other have changed dramatically. Like we actually don't know it, we don't use these terms, but we care about things like how apps adjust to different form factors, to the progressive nature of apps, and we care about performance and latencies and things like that in a way that we haven't in the past. Now, of course, over the last 18 months, that have brought their own set of challenges, and really, not to belabor this point, I think that these fall into two categories that all tie back to this idea of how do we do more and how do we accelerate our use of these tools and these platforms that we have available to us. And on the back end of this, there's this immediate need to sort of in crisis mode, right? How do we adjust to a business model that was largely based on in-person visits and interactions, to how do we adapt that to something that is, has to live with stay-at-home orders and the like. And we've, I think, largely been very successful at doing so. I think remarkably successful. And now that we're looking ahead, we still have this surge to come that says there's a lot of work, a lot of things in healthcare that weren't done over the last 12 to 18 months. Things like screening, like preventative care, like elective procedures. And these are all coming, right? They're piling up on the ahead of us. And so we need to think about what are the things that we're going to do in order to prepare for that. How do we continue to manage the crisis, but also to get ready for this incoming heap of work that we expect to hit us. Ultimately, I think the heart of this is developers, and this is a broad term. I think we all sort of come up with a vision, an image in our head when we start talking about the development team of what their job is in the organization and how they fit in. But we're really talking about expanding that definition of developers, right? Developers write C# and Java, they write Terraform, they write automation workflows, they write Python, and these go beyond the core set of developers that we've been talking about. We've heard today all about no code, low code, rapid application development that is pulling on these sort of developer adjacent folks in the organization to help them solve problems without having to pull in a full dev team. And if you think about the timing of this has been remarkable, like it is as horrendous as it has been, we never would have been able to meet the needs, the productivity demands, and be as flexible as we've been able to be over the last 18 months if it wasn't for this point in time. If we didn't have the tools and the platforms that were sort of already being built to build on top of. And so these folks, these individuals, right, it turns out that they're a huge catalyst to our success in any kind of digital transformation. They're building, right, those digital platforms. And a few years ago, Microsoft started to ask the question, what is it about the organizations that really run ahead of the pack? What are the organizations that have been able to not just attract and retain the right talent in a fiercely competitive environment, but has been able to make the most of that talent? And so both with some internal studies and working with external partners, we started to think about what are those characteristics and to come up with a measure, this measure that we call developer velocity, to try to determine what are those things that we should be looking at, what are the type of culture that we should build in order to make this group of developers, again, not just traditional full stack developers, but our entire developer community more productive. How can we help them scale? And developer velocity is not just about how do we get software out the door faster. It's really about how do we create this environment where people can be their most creative selves, that they can actually push the tools and push the platforms to meet the business goals of their organization, and to do it in a way that does inspire creativity to come up with new solutions, creative solutions to potentially old problems. Now, this is not a talk about developer velocity specifically, but I think that it is an interesting context to help us make the cloud more productive, right? Many of the interactions that I have with architects and developers across our healthcare customers come down to either I'm going to, how can I help get you started if they're new to Azure or even new to this part or this service within Azure, or how can I optimize what I've already done, right? How can I do it better? How can I do it faster? How can I do it maybe more cheaply? And so today I'm focusing really on that set of tools and resources, right? This isn't specifically a product conversation. It's not even a technology conversation. It's really about, hey, these are things that if you're an IT pro, if you're a developer, these are my go-to tools that I'm always talking about with customers that I think really can help accelerate the work that your team is doing and help you build these sort of this composition of solutions in the cloud much easier. So really quickly, I'm going to go through, I think, what are some of those foundational things. So first is tools. Tools is easy. Use the right tool for the job. Yes, Microsoft is a long-term platform and tools company. I think we have great tools. We have very popular tools. But by no means should the platform ever dictate the tool, right? And so if you are using, PyChart or Notepad, if you are using IntelliJ or NetBeans, you keep using those, right? Because that's where you've invested. And the platform should adjust and accommodate to those. And in fact, it's going to have to continue to accommodate because these tools are changing all the time. I actually think that the most interesting or important box on this slide is the API box. to me, the actual fulfillment, the realization of the promise of software modularity, like we've been talking about in industry for decades, how do we decompose software into building blocks that then can be reused and tied together, it's just never fully panned out the way that it has in recent years, with the internet, with the cloud, with RESTful APIs and the sort of variations of those like WebSockets. Have actually created that environment where we can, as developers, both traditional and full stack developers, as well as low code and no code developers, start to build on top of what each other has done, right? We can take advantage of those components that others have already built and deployed. And so I think APIs are at the core of this, and they really become the glue that ties together all of these different services that we're going to use when we build applications. I'm not going to belabor the point on low code, no code, and rapid application development. We absolutely, I think that this is a super critical area of investment. It's clearly not a new idea, but it's an idea that's seen so much growth. And again, I think a lot of it is because of this API economy. In reality, what we see is really great examples, powerful use cases of people building solutions with these low-code environments. We have customers like St. Luke's that have reduced the amount of paperwork that they require from providers. We have nurses in another organization that are building, patient automations, discharge process that improves the patient experience overall. These are great examples. In most cases, they also then leverage some API, some other service that either somebody within the company has built, another developer, or somebody outside, an external SaaS service or some other API that you need to call in order to get some work done. And low-code environments give you that sort of canvas on which to tie these things together. So I think they are super important. But it also demonstrates to us that that development is a team sport, right? It's not any one group, but it's the combination of all those groups. And the thing that I want to highlight here is that, again, it's not just the tool, but it's what culture the tools can bring and introduce into the organization. This developer velocity research that we've done, one of the things that we found is that especially in organizations that are not traditionally tech companies or traditionally software companies, the adoption of open source and open source methodologies, it has a dramatic impact on their productivity and the speed at which they can deploy and they can innovate. It shouldn't be a huge surprise. There's a ton of the code that we deploy in both enterprise and consumer-facing applications. That it's over 90% of the actual source code is open source. It all comes from libraries, and that is sort of what our industry is built on now. What we need to do next is to learn from those open source communities how to do to collaborate better in a distributed world, right? Because that's what open source has always been. And so we need to adopt more of those principles. Now, this is not about just any one specific tool that can impart culture into your organization, but it's about learning from the way that this work is done, right? That when, as a developer, for a long time, tools like GitHub, this is the community that I will go to. If I want to start a new project, I think I want to write a web app that's going to use some JavaScript and a React framework, and I need some WebSockets to get real-time updates from, let's say, a weather API. I'm going to go to GitHub and see what somebody else has already written. And I want to build that sort of recurring theme as we're talking today is ultimately we want to start to empower our developers, our IT pros, to think in terms of open source, or what we call inner source within an enterprise, is to say, when you have a problem to solve, the first thing you do is to go and look and find somebody else that has solved either that problem or something very similar, and then build on top of it. And so that's what these resources are really all about, right? Is how can you take advantage of work that that I've done, that my peers have done, and that your peers have done, and have kindly published back out into the community so that we can all benefit from it. And finally, you've seen a slide like this before. Of course, public cloud is a huge factor in the speed in which, especially non-tech companies, not traditionally tech companies, can innovate and drive. And it's partially technology, it's partially platform, it's partially about choice of services within that platform. But largely, it's, I've always been a big believer in this idea that building solutions in the cloud is a collection of services. It's about composition, composing individual services that have integrations baked back in. And so that's your job, is to compose solutions with this set of services. Again, what I want to do today is to just help point out what are the types of resources that might help accelerate that process. When we talk about public clouds, of course, right, in this particular industry, we need to be careful of the regulations that we need to consider. And so many of these resources that we're going to talk about are specifically targeted at how do we make sure we're answering the right questions, we're asking the right questions of our architects, of our designers, to make sure that we're baking things like security and compliance and privacy into the application right from the beginning. So a set of resources, and I'm going to focus on application modernization because that's what I do with customers on a daily basis. It's where I spend most of my time. How do we leverage patterns and practices for modernizing applications? That gives you sort of direct access to the unfiltered benefits of the public cloud in a way that really lift and shifting of applications into the cloud doesn't always. Lift and shift gives you a great head start. There are absolutely cost savings and other efficiencies to be had there. But until we start thinking outside of the box of the individual servers, then there really is sort of a bunch of headroom in any cloud provider and any cloud deployment that we're missing out on. So most of what I'm talking about are focused on how do you go from what you have today into a more modern deployment in Azure. So the first tool that I want to make sure that you guys are aware of, I want to talk about a little bit, is the Architecture Center. This is part of our documentation platform. I'm not going to give you a tour of the website, but it's full of patterns and practices, best practices for reliability in your applications, for improving the performance of your applications, for tuning those. It even includes information for those of you that are familiar maybe with AWS or GCP to help make that translation into sort of terminology and the framework of Azure as it compares to other providers. Now, like software, docs are never perfect. I get that. I think they're way better than they ever have been. And so I do encourage you to go out and take a look here. This is one of the resources that I can't tell you how many conversations I have with architects and development teams and IT pros at my customers that we can take the conversation and we can start referencing individual best practices or recommendations out of the Architecture Center, and it's like a light bulb goes off where it's like we're not just talking about this, we can talk about how it applies to you specifically, but it gives us a framework, it gives us context to go back and say, well, these are recommendations that come out of having run and worked with enterprise customers at a very large scale for years now. And so we want to give you that head start when you're just getting started. Part of the Architecture Center is reference architectures, and I think it's probably one of the most popular parts of the Architecture Center. Specifically within healthcare, we've started to build out a library of reference architectures for different scenarios that we've been working with customers on. And so I thought I'd highlight a few of these because I think they are super interesting, a good place to start when you're thinking about building something new. If we start super simple, this is with a web app. It's it's a mainstay and it's still a huge part of any kind of cloud deployment, right, as a web or a mobile app. I think what's notable here is, of course, we don't want to have any traditional infrastructure. There's no servers to maintain or patch or support here. It also is, we're going to focus on platform services like app service rather than always bringing in the complexity of something like a Kubernetes cluster running on Azure, though there's certainly that's coming up. But while as simple as this is, right, the things we want to consider, the things that the document will help with is just making sure that we've got that checklist, that we're thinking about availability, we're thinking about compliance and security as we're designing and building this application out, so that those aren't questions that we come back and have to ask later. Or when we are asked those questions later by audit or security or somebody else, we have well-reasoned, well-thought-out answers to their questions. So this is the super simple example, right? But now you start to increase the complexity. This is an example of IoT platform reference architecture for fever detection using febrile cameras at either in a retail or warehouse kind of space, or even in a provider's office. And so there's some more interesting things going on here. We're generally using a Lambda data architecture with a hot path, cold path. We've introduced Kubernetes as the core microservices orchestrator for the business logic. I actually think it's interesting that over here on the right, we're also now starting to always see APIs creep up into pretty much every solution design, where we're creating this interface to talk to internal applications, but also third parties and external applications. And so I also included a second URL here for AKS specifically for Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a pretty complex environment, no matter where you deploy it or what you're doing with it. And so there's a lot to learn there. And so we've built out what we call a secure baseline, which is a set of guidance recommendations that also live in the Architecture Center for deploying a production Kubernetes environment. What are the types of configurations, levers, and knobs that you're going to want to turn in order to make sure that you haven't left anything open for attack or any questions going forward. And the last one I'll highlight here is a telehealth system. I've actually personally worked with a number of customers that have built and deployed telehealth or televisit systems on Azure, and I think this is a super interesting one. Obviously, we've had a huge uptick in this type of solution in recent months, but what I think is really interesting is that it is like the quintessential cloud native example, right? It's a completely service-based composition. We're not looking at infrastructure, we're not deploying servers, but if you look at all the different things that a telehealth system has to do, it's really about leveraging code that others have written and then focusing on where you add value, right? These are not customers that are building their own stack for chat and audio and video calls. They're not building their own stack for scheduling appointments, for customer outreach, right? All of those are both internal, some custom services, some of them are Microsoft services, some of them are third-party services, but it's a composition of services that really make this work. And so I think it's a great example. But again, it's just another sample of the types of starting points that we try to make available out on the Architecture Center. Now, we also have another great place to start is the Quick Start Center. Now, this is just right in the portal. If you search for Quick Start, you'll find it, and it gives you project samples and templates, some setup guidance for how to configure Azure services. And it's a great place to start if you're experimenting with a new idea, you're going to kick off a new project or a new POC. A lot of times it can lay out framework for you and really get you started much faster. It's a small sample of what I was talking about earlier, which is this idea of always starting, always start on GitHub, always start with what somebody else has built so that you're not starting from a blank page. And so we curate and publish our own set of samples out on GitHub, but I encourage you, use the search box, right? If you need to deploy a VM scale set or a new data lake, then those templates are out there and put you, get you started much faster rather than always starting again from a blank page. Okay, so I'm going to go into the rapid fire section. I know I've already been talking pretty quickly, but think about these as these are sort of like my top 8 resources. Again, goal here today was to just get you visibility to the types of resources that I'm working with customers on all the time. These are the types of things that really do, I think, make a difference to people once they know about them. So really quickly, number 1, I'm going to point out the WellArchitected Framework. Now this is sort of an overlap. It is technically part of the Architecture Center, but it's more than just documentation. In the case of the WellArchitected Framework, it is targeted at these 5 pillars right now: a reliability framework, a well-architected framework for cost optimization, performance efficiency, and so on. But what I encourage you to do, certainly take a look at that documentation. If you're building a new application or you have an application that's going to be going to production in the not too distant future, then use these as guidelines for the types of questions you should be asking of the development team and of your infrastructure and your deployment team in order to get things right out of the gate. Now, you can go a step further than that, reach out to your Microsoft team or to a Microsoft partner and ask about an engagement to get a solution architect such as myself, or like I said, an architect from a partner to work with you and to go methodically through the architecture, through your application or through your intended design, and look for opportunities to apply best practices so that you hit the ground running. Number 2, a tool that I want to make sure everybody is aware of and using is the Azure Advisor. This is also built into the portal. It's a free service. It's automatically will look at your deployed resources in Azure and make recommendations around security and cost and efficiency. Again, this is you don't need to have a support plan or anything. This is a free service. It is, I would say, it's a great first step at making sure that you're leveraging some common best practices. Things like, are you purchasing reserved capacity or reserved instances to keep your costs down? Have you over deployed VMs and compute that's just not getting used? And so we'll recommend that you scale those back. And security recommendations based on the deployment that we've seen as well. So definitely take a look here. It doesn't replace a full-on architecture review, but it is a great place to start in order to get that low-hanging fruit out of the way. Azure Monitor is my number 3. It doesn't really matter if you're using Azure Monitor or a different sort of full stack observability platform, but it's especially important when you are building these cloud applications to think about observability right from the get-go. It's a very different world when we're composing individual services that potentially come from different providers and expecting them to all always work together exactly as we intend. And this is harder to track and harder to manage than it was in the old days of building a monolithic system where everything runs in the same memory space. And so Azure Monitor does give you that full stack visibility from applications to infrastructure, both on-prem and in the cloud and across clouds. But again, if it's not Azure Monitor, make sure that it's something, and it's something you think about early in the development process, because it'll benefit those developers as well, not just something that you turn on at the end of when you go to production deployment. Number 4 in my list is at the Azure Service Health Portal. I'm surprised at how many people don't necessarily know about this or don't use it proactively. This is the area in the portal that will give you visibility to service incidents that may impact your deployment specifically. So it's not just a broad notification that says that there is maybe an outage or a performance issue or something going on in the service, but it is tuned to your deployment so that you have reasonable confidence that it's something that you should care about. You can set up, and you should set up, alerts and notifications on these so that it's not something that you have to go and proactively check, but that the portal will give you notifications if there's an incident that you should be aware of. And then you can coordinate with your Microsoft support team for how to, if there's any action and how you should respond. Number 5 is a set of key recommendations that I just think everybody should sort of have in the back of their mind. Some of these are not free, some of these are additional services, but they're things, again, you should consider either the platform service or a third party. There are some easy ones like turning on WAF and DDoS protection for any time you have a website, especially internet facing, but internally facing as well. Things like making sure that you have firewalls on where you have virtual networks deployed, and leverage Azure Secure, because this is, again, a reporting mechanism that can be proactively looking at your deployments and make recommendations as to where you could make improvements. Number 6 is especially when we're working with healthcare customers, we're always talking about, always concerned about HIPAA and high trust compliance for your applications that handle sensitive and healthcare data. And I can't emphasize enough, use Azure Blueprints, use Azure Policy if you're not doing it today. Specifically for this audience, we do have a starter template for HIPAA high trust, and so it gives you a great way to just observe a deployment and get recommendations on where your configuration may be out of technical compliance. But it is the most powerful tool for applying hierarchical sort of top-down governance across a group of subscriptions within Azure in order to make sure that you are meeting your internal security and compliance goals, as well as the goals set forth by some of these standards. So definitely look into Azure Blueprints and Policy if you're not using those today. Speaking of pushing standards and automation, those tools in Blueprints and Policy, you're probably already doing infrastructure as code. If you're using ARM templates, I highly encourage you to start looking at Bicep and start to integrate that into your automation environment. It's actually 100% compatible with ARM. Think of it as a abstraction that lives on top of ARM templates, so that you don't have to deal with the complexity of writing JSON code manually anymore. It is much, much nicer than ARM, and it's super powerful. The really nice thing about it is that because it has 100% compatibility with ARM, it supports every service and every feature that's deployed in Azure on day one, including preview services. And so you'll never have that gap in time where a new service is deployed, but you can't automate the deployment of it. You'll always be able to use Bicep in order to meet that need. If you're already deep into using something like Terraform to automate your deployments in Azure, that's great. I think you should still be familiar with Bicep, because there may be areas where you use ARM or Bicep in order to augment what you're doing in Terraform. But the goal is not for you to replace everything that you're doing in Terraform with Bicep. Bicep is really focused on being the native solution built into Azure on top of ARM. So for those of you that are using ARM today, definitely take a look at Bicep. If you haven't already, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. And finally, almost finally, this is number 8, is just again, back to sort of the point about documentation and self-help and enablement. You want your developers and that broader developer community to be able to absorb as much as they can. And so there's actually a lot of self-paced training that's available out here on the Docs website. Many of these modules can spin up an Azure subscription behind the scenes so that they can actually interact and deploy and build things as part of the learning path. And many of these chain together in order to support certification paths and help you get ready to take a certification exam if that's something that you want to do. You can also reach out to your Microsoft team or to a partner and talk about how we can augment these things using various programs in order to help sort of build an event around getting your team certified, setting goals for education across that team. And we've worked with a lot of development teams in healthcare around sort of building this into their own corporate learning plan, so that it can be not a separate thing, but actually part of their expectations and part of their goals that come up in their performance review, if you want to go that way. Yeah, and then finally, I think this is actually number 9. I said there were 8. Help and support built right into the portal. Please, don't hesitate to use it when you run into one of those blockers. You can always submit a support request right there from the portal, from the resource that you're having the problem with, and it'll give you all the options for how to get support or email support, or if you have enterprise support, then this will automatically notify that account manager that you submitted a request. So that's it.